So, for everyone, I want everyone to know that this is something that kind of happened by accident for me. It was never really my life's plan to become a healer or spiritual teacher. It's one of those things that kind of happened along the way because to give just a very short bit of background, then we'll get into my sacred story, which is the good stuff. I grew up as the typical computer nerd. As a boy, I loved video games and fantasy and sci-fi and Dungeons and Dragons and all that kind of stuff. And when it came time for me to figure out what I wanted to do with my life, it was easy. Because the one thing that I was really good at that I could get paid for was programming computers. So I ended up in college at MIT. And to make a long story very short, made internetworking the focus of my studies. And this was back, I got there in the 80s, pre-internet, but they had the online computer network at MIT that was connected to the internet. So I just fell in love with the online world. And, I'd like to say that unlike Al Gore, I actually am one of the people that invented the internet, though admittedly, I was a very, very tiny cog in an extremely large wheel. And so I got my bachelor's degree, continued on at grad school at MIT, got my master's degree, and I was actually working towards my PhD when the internet boom hit. And so I left grad school along with a lot of my lab mates, and I figured, well, I'll move to California, recruit some friends, start an internet company, work really hard for a couple of years, and then sell my company for millions of dollars and retire to some tropical island. And that was kind of my plan. And it actually got off to a pretty good start. It's funny in retrospect that the very first website I ever created in my life was the website for the launch of the Sony PlayStation in the summer of 1995. So that was my first website. And we got a lot of high-profile websites. I did websites for Disneyland and Nissan Motors and several divisions of Sony. And it was a really exciting time, and we even started the second company to create an entirely kind of online game that never existed before. Today we call them MMORPGs, or massively multiplayer online games, and I created the very first one that was ever developed called Underlight, which launched in 1997. But all this came with a price, and I was working literally, no exaggeration, 80 to 100 hours a week to try to bootstrap 2 startup companies right at the beginning of the internet boom. And it was just nonstop. It was 7 days a week, early morning to late night, no breaks, no vacations, no weekends, no holidays. I just worked. I ate, I slept, I worked. And after a couple of years of this, my body broke down. And I developed a really severe case of what we now call repetitive stress injuries. And so, again, to make a really long story very short, I spent 3 years in conventional treatments, spending several hours a day running to different doctors and physical therapists and occupational retraining and so on. And I didn't get better, I got worse. And by 1998, my pain was so bad, I had to move in with my parents because I couldn't even cut my food on some days. I couldn't hold a book open because it was too painful for me. I could only drive in 10-minute increments because it was too painful to hold a steering wheel. So I was in, really severe pain. And I could barely work by this point. And so, that's when I went through the first dark night of the soul, which I'm sure a lot of the listeners are familiar with. What that means is everything goes wrong in your life all at once. And so for me, one thing that happened was the doctors gave up on me. After 3 years of treatment, I had kind of climbed up the food chain. I spent years at the Curlin Job Clinic, where a lot of Olympians and professional athletes go, and saw all the best doctors. And then one day in 1998, I got called in to see the head honcho. And he said, "Brent, I'm sorry. There's nothing more we can do for you. You're never going to be out of pain. You're never going to be able to work again. And I really hope there's someone that can take care of you until you die." And I was 27 when I got this news. I also had a falling out with my partners because I couldn't work anymore. And the website company got sold for several $1 million, and I ended up in a dispute with them, and there were multiple lawsuits, and it was just a big mess. And what I call the cherry on top of the sundae was my lifelong best friend and business partner, I found out was also secretly dating the woman that I was crazy in love with. So I had a physical tragedy, a multi-million-dollar financial loss, and a terrible heartbreak all rolled up in one. And, this was devastating. I was depressed. I started drinking a lot. I was fortunate that I didn't stay stuck in despair for too long because I had a buddy of mine get me into positive thinking. And nowadays we call it the law of attraction, but back in the 90s we called it positive thinking, and it's really kind of the same stuff. And so I started going to positive thinking seminars, and I put power words on my wall and made a vision board and joined masterminds and did all that good stuff. And, again, long story short, it didn't help. I'm not saying those are wrong things. I'm just saying for me it was insufficient. It wasn't enough. And so, I then ended up spending 5 years in alternative therapies. And I thought, oh my gosh, maybe acupuncture or herbs or chiropractic or homeopathy or cleansing or something like that would help me. So I spent 5 years on disability as a full-time patient trying every kind of treatment under the sun, running up an enormous credit card bill. And nothing worked. And not only did it not get better, I just kept getting worse. And I found out later there was a lot of reasons for that. I had had Lyme disease for almost 17 years before it got diagnosed. I had been a victim of severe chemical poisoning, and there were all these reasons why nothing worked for me. But I didn't know that at the time. And so after 5 years of full-time therapies, and just so everyone knows, when I say I tried acupuncture, I don't mean I had like 5 sessions. I mean I went out and found the best Chinese doctor in town and saw him twice a week for 2 years. So I was really, really trying hard to get better, but nothing worked for me. And it was then that really the sacred story begins. And this isn't something I normally talk about very much, so that this is really unique. So for the listeners, this is the first time I've ever discussed this in a public forum. And it was after in early 2003, I had agreed to have an experimental surgery because nothing else was working for me, and I was really desperate. And I had the surgery, and instead of making me better, it made me much worse. And when I woke up from the surgery, my arm was frozen. And so, that I've talked about before. That's not the unique piece. What happened was my arm was frozen for 4 months. And about 3 months in, I was going for all these different treatments, and I went to physical therapists, and they tried manipulations, and I slept in dynasplints, and I had doctors try to inject me with stuff, and I was doing all these things to try to get my arm to move, and it wouldn't go. It was totally frozen. I was driving to a friend's place to play Dungeons & Dragons. And fortunately, my car was an automatic, so I couldn't use my right arm at all. And so I was driving to go to his place in Venice, and I was on 4th Street in Santa Monica, traveling south. And this was a long time before I got into any of the New Age or spiritual mystical stuff. I'd been into alternative medicine. I'd done lots of acupuncture, but that was about it. And what happened to me was I was driving to my friend's house, and I stopped at a stop sign on 4th Street. And I had a really, to me at the time, I didn't really understand what was happening. I just thought of it as maybe a weird spiritual thing or, a hallucination. Where when I was stopped at the stop sign, I felt like I got pulled up into the air. And I was up on a cross. And I was like, this is weird, right? And what I saw was a man come up to me. And I couldn't really make out his features, but he said to me, he said, Brent, it's almost time for you to come down off the cross. And then it all disappeared, and I was back in my car. And, I didn't really know what to make of it at the time. And it was just a few weeks after that I had a healing session with a woman, her name was Terry O'Connell. And she explained to me the importance of the subconscious mind and introduced me to and trained me to a theta wave and how to do muscle testing to check for blocks and do block clearings. And we had a session. And honestly, I didn't think anything was going to happen because I'd been to Reiki healers and pranic healers, and it felt nice, but it didn't seem to make any lasting difference. And we had a session, and she asked me about my belief in God and what had happened with my best friend and all the pain I'd been in and all the losses I'd experienced. And we talked a little about my childhood, and she was doing this block clearing thing the whole time. And at the end of the hour, she goes, okay, Brent, we're going to heal your elbow. And I'm like, great, right, go crazy. And this is all done with the mind. There's no hands-on. There was no supplements or no physical manipulation or machine or anything like that. It's all done with the mind and energy. And she's sitting across the room from me, and she kind of closes her eyes and goes into a meditative trance. And I'm like looking out the window. I was thinking about, gee, what I want to have for lunch on the way home, right? And that's when the first miracle happened, which was I felt a little pop or snap in my elbow. And she opened her eyes and kind of smiled and said, okay, Brent, try your arm. And I did, and I was like, oh, my God. I had experienced a genuine miracle. In an instant, my arm unfroze and I could move it again. And so that was the miraculous healing that hooked me into this world. And, my whole life changed in that moment. And I dedicated myself to figuring out what had happened. I remember looking at Terry and saying, Terry, I don't know what you just did, but I got to learn this. And that started me really on my spiritual path. And I walked away from engineering, which I hadn't really been able to do for years anyway because of my health. And I decided to become a full-time healer. But I'm the first to admit I was not born with any amazing, intuitive, or natural gift of healing. I was never the kind of person that could see someone's ancestors crowded around their head giving you messages. I never saw angels dancing on my bedpost or anything like that. I was just a normal guy. I was just a computer geek. And so I figured, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the assets I do have, which was a great analytical mind, a great education, and all my experience as a scientist and engineer. And I spent about the next decade seeking out the best healers and spiritual teachers and gurus and masters, learning from them, and slowly reverse engineering what they were doing. Because what I wanted to do was I wanted to take the new age spiritual mystical stuff and figure out the real science behind it. Because to me, a miracle is simply a phenomena that science is not sufficiently advanced to be able to explain or replicate. It all happens through natural law. It's just there's a lot more to the universe than our science can explain. And so I did that. And I spent a lot of years with a lot of healers and teachers, made a lot of mistakes, wasted a lot of money on a lot of bad seminars and books and sessions, and also spent, was fortunate to find some real gems, some amazing content that changed my life. And so this all led to the second part of the sacred story, which again, I'm a little shy about this because it's not something I talk about publicly, which was in 2012, ironically. And up to that point, I had been studying a lot of different spiritual systems, like some of the listeners may have. And one I never really understood was the study of awakening. Some call it Advaita Vedanta in the East, or non-duality. It's really the understanding of what awareness and consciousness is. It's really the most fundamental spiritual study. And I had heard lots of the metaphors about the movie projector and the observer, but it never really made sense to me. And after working with a lot of amazing teachers and healers and intuitives, I had come across a teacher who was teaching a class on the psychology of consciousness, on non-duality. And it was in Marina del Rey, very close to where my friend lived, where I had gone 10 years before. And my awakening started actually on the drive home from the class. And this is what's so funny. It's like it must be some kind of cosmic joke. I was on 4th Street in Santa Monica, driving north, going the other way, in almost exactly the same spot where I had that first mystical experience so many years before. And I remember it had been a long class, and I was, just kind of going through all what I'd learned in my mind, and I'm driving home, and I stop at a stop sign on 4th Street. And it hit me like a bolt of lightning. That's when the awakening happened for Brent. And I had this sudden realization, and I said to myself, oh my gosh, I get it. I am not Brent. And so that was the moment of Brent's awakening. And for the listeners, I know it sounds a little funny for me to say it in the third person. I do that intentionally because that's one of the core teachings, that all of us are so falsely identified with the ego, which may be the body or the mind or the personality or the bank account or the family, that we have no idea what awareness really is, what our true identity is. And that's really what the study of awakening is, that even with all my years of education and the supposedly big brain, it took me over a decade of study, but I finally got it. All the teachings suddenly became clear. And it was so crazy that I had that first mystical experience before I knew anything about the New Age world, being told I was going to come off the cross. And I thought for a long time that they were referring to the instant healing of my elbow. In retrospect, what they meant was the awakening process. And it only took 9 years, which, in terms of the soul or the lifetime of the spirit is a blink of an eye. And now I know what they meant by it's about time for you to come off the cross. Because awakening really is the beginning of the end of suffering. It's the direct path to the top of the mountain. It's often been called the foot in the door to enlightenment. And now I see how my whole life had been a setup for that. And the reason I created Awakening Dynamics, I have to say that creating my own system wasn't really something I had planned on. It's a gigantic headache, huge amount of work and expense. But I had to. Because after experiencing awakening, I knew that there was nothing out there I found that could provide a tight integration and synthesis of both the premier tools of consciousness, the metaphysics. By that I mean processes for instant healing, for subconscious clearing, for embodiment, for penetrating mythologies, for creating abundance, for manifesting love, for emotional transformation. All those metaphysical tools I had spent many years reverse engineering and developing and advancing the state of the art. But what I saw was that there was actually very little in the so-called spiritual world that was actually spiritual. And that's not a bad thing, but really everything I had studied up to that point was primarily different mechanisms to let the ego manipulate through non-physical means. That's not wrong or bad. I just want to alert everybody that there's so much more available. And so I wanted to tightly integrate and create a cohesive system that would teach people both the foundation of the pure spirituality, the study of awakening, this ascension of consciousness, this really primal, direct, pure aspect of spirit, that foot in the door to enlightenment. I wanted to combine that with the state-of-the-art metaphysical tools. And to do that, I had to create something new that didn't exist before. And, it took me 4 years to do so, but I then created the system of Awakening Dynamics to be that synthesis, to offer people both the cutting-edge tools of consciousness for doing physical healings, emotional healings. I can teach you how to clear a subconscious block in a couple seconds. To do instant healings takes a little longer, maybe about half a minute. To teach these things and make them really easy and accessible to people, but to do more than just give you tools to manipulate from ego, I also wanted to tightly integrate that with the ascension of consciousness. And I've been very blessed to have come across some amazing resources and learned how to do that, I think, in a pretty effective way. And that's why I'm here today, to share a little more of my story than I ever have before. And I know it's a little out there, but this really happened. And it sounds kind of funny coming from someone who's very much a diehard engineer and scientist who believes very much in logic and reason and analysis. But that's exactly what I wanted to bring to the world, to bring that scientific edge and rigor to the mysticism and the spirituality, to create something that's very pure and very functional, something that every person can use to see differences in their life. And that's why I like to emphasize I'm really an engineer, not a scientist, because scientists discover the principles, but engineers apply them to create real things in life. And so I'm an engineer. I want to show you how to take these breakthroughs in these tools of consciousness and create real things in your life. So if you want a bridge that stays up, you want an engineer. You want to build a skyscraper, an airplane, you need an engineer. You want to build the internet, you need a bunch of engineers. And so I'm here to be the engineer to show you how to use the tools of the mind and consciousness and spirituality to create real changes in life. And, of course, part of that is the obvious stuff, physical healing, emotional healing, making money, finding love. But those are actually, I think, secondary to the pursuit of ascension of consciousness. I think that's why we're all really here, to learn to ascend consciousness, to penetrate suffering, to find a whole new way of living.